Welcome back to An Anthropologist and a Cat discuss Judith Butler. Today, we are finally getting into Undoing Gender, which is so exciting. This is where Gender Trouble was written in 1990. This one is 2004. Still like 13 years ago, but updated. Better than 27 years ago. Because a lot of things have changed in, 27 years. But the argument could be made that things have changed in 13 years. But, anyway, today we are discussing Chapter 1, Beside Oneself, on the Limits of Sexual Autonomy. So, one of the things Butler opens with is talking about grief, grieving, and what makes a grievable life. Which I think, she doesn't directly kick back to Freud and the discussion we had a few videos back on, the melancholia of gender. But it's, people don't, she says, I don't think, for instance, you can invoke a Protestant ethic when it comes to loss. You can't say, oh, I'll go through loss this way, and that will be the result, and I'll apply myself to the task, and I'll endeavor to achieve the resolution of grief that is before me. You can see this in a lot of situations. People handle grief differently. Some people, like Freud says, internalize the crap out of it. Other people, grieve more directly. Some people, getting back to a sense of normalcy is how they grieve. But grief is something that delineates the ties we have to others, that shows us that those ties constitute a sense of self, compose who we are, and that when we lose them, we lose our composure in some fundamental sense. We do not know who we are or what to do. I think this is really true if you lose someone particularly close to you. You briefly, you lose a bit of yourself. I'm not going to get really personal here, because I could. Because, loss is a big thing. But, again, not getting into that right now. Grief displays the way in which we are in the thrall of our relations with others that we cannot always recount or explain, that often interrupts the self-conscious account of ourselves we might try to provide in ways that challenge the very notion of ourselves as autonomous and in control. This is especially true for control freaks like me. I don't like my emotions or my feelings doing something without my authorization. And, Butler goes on, and this is a great quote. Let's face it, we're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something. So, and then Butler goes on, talking about individualism versus, being outside oneself or beside oneself in regards to, passion and grief. And looking about this, especially involving politics, we have to quote, present ourselves as bounded beings, distinct, recognizable, delineated, subjects before the law, a community defined by sameness. But perhaps we make a mistake if we take the definitions of who we are legally to be adequate descriptions of what we are about. That is almost self-explanatory. We define ourselves by the groups we're part of. If we take those definitions, make them ourselves, it's really hard to actually define who we are. I'm not going to quote Moana right here, but I kind of want to. No, we're not going to. As much as I love a good Disney movie, we are not going to do that. we ask the state, for instance, keep its laws off our bodies. Yes, please. And we call for principles of bodily self-defense and bodily integrity to be accepted as political goods. Yet it is through the body that gender and sexuality become exposed to others, implicated in social processes, inscribed by cultural norms, and apprehended in their social meanings. So, and that's a big thing. We're wanting this autonomy for ourselves, for our bodies. And it's difficult to make these claims without a sense of bodily autonomy. Like, my body is mine. That's a fact. And Butler goes on to make a point, I can say right now that my body is mine, but the very bodies for which we struggle are not quite ever only our own, because we exist in public, and with that, that's a thing. We have to exist in public, unless you're a hermit. But even then, you have to, get food somehow. To extent, and then, Butler goes on to talk about 9/11 and, the mourning, fear, anxiety, rage that people felt then and some still feel now. We're surrounded by violence, whether directly or indirectly. And to the extent that we commit this violence, we're acting upon another, putting others at risk, and causing damage to others. Which Butler makes this point because our lives are also dependent on others. Whether in the, this person has a gun and may shoot me sense, or, depending on doctors, nurses, medical professionals to take care of us if we are obviously in need of that. So, and can become the basis of claims for non-militaristic political solutions, one which we cannot will away, one which we must attend to, even abide by, as we begin to think about what politics might be implied by staying with the thought of corporeal vulnerability itself. What I think we're meaning here is, let's try to make political solutions that aren't going to kill people. I know, very radical idea. Especially right now with what's going on in Syria and still in the Middle East. It's not getting better with the current presidency. Once again, I could do an entire video on this and I'm not going to. And, this is a good quote. To grieve and to make grief itself into a resource for politics is not to be resigned to a simple passivity or powerlessness. So I think what Butler means here is that politicians like to play off people's emotions, especially grief. If you want to make somebody sympathetic to a person, be they alive or deceased, you're going to, put forth, mother of two, perfect American family. You want to make people relatable, and yet if something happens, you want people to feel grief for that. You want them to feel, something. For example, when there's a tragedy, and this is going to make me sound so callous, but the victims are always, college student, grandfather of 8. You're looking at things that will make you grieve them as opposed to other things, because it makes people feel things. When they feel things, they don't feel as powerless, which, it's a big deal. And then Butler goes on to talk about, infancy and how everybody is dependent on, in this case, some sort of parental figure when one is a small child. And then, there's no way to get rid of this primary vulnerability. And then to counter oppression requires that one understands that lives are supported and maintained, differentially. That there are radically different ways in which human physical vulnerability is distributed across the globe. So it's pretty much like a cultural parenting and, people thing. Like, in Europe, you've got paid parental leave. It's like required by law. Whereas here in the US, people have to stock up on vacation time, even with FMLA, which is the Family Medical Leave Act. You have a lot of that's unpaid. And it's kind of a hot mess. Because, we call ourselves one of the most advanced countries in the world, and then, people have to, deal with a lot of things after you have to leave your kid. And there's not enough resources for people to get treatment easily for their postpartum depression or anxiety or, what else. And a lot of this really, this chapter talks a lot about, people's autonomy, and goes on several pages later. We might think that the question of how one does one's gender is a merely cultural question or an indulgence on the part of those who insist on exercising bourgeois freedom in excessive dimensions. To say, however, that gender is performative is not simply to insist on a right to produce a pleasurable and subversive spectacle, but to allegorize the spectacular and consequential ways in which reality is both reproduced and contested. Reality is a social construction, as well as anything else. People's perceptions of reality are different. And Butler goes on talking about the new forms of gender, and, quote, "The genders I have in mind have been in existence for a long time, but they've not been admitted into the terms that govern reality," which I think in my previous video, yes, I talk about, how Butler's wanting all this stuff for gender, and I questioned, because Butler doesn't explicitly say, what other genders she was thinking of, which she expands upon in this chapter. So, and then we bring back our good buddy Michel Foucault, and then Butler goes on to, sexuality when working with lesbian and gay human rights. The sexuality is not simply an attribute one has or a disposition or pattern set of inclinations. It is a mode of being disposed toward others, including in the mode of fantasy, and sometimes only in the mode of fantasy. So, we're arguing all of these things, and this violence that we're dealing with is, we have to follow our institutions and work on fighting the ones that are, bad. And then Butler goes on to talk about, human rights and working for human rights. At which point she says, working towards LGBTI. At this point, LGBTI. Personally, I'm thinking LGBTQIA, but an anti-imperialist or minimally non-imperialist conception of international human rights must call into question what is meant by the human and learn from the various ways and means by which it is defined across cultural venues. once again, we have to be culturally competent, culturally relativistic. And if we're not, keeping up with how people treat other humans, then what is the point, especially of anthropology, of any of this? And then I'm gonna close this video with another really good quote from the end of a chapter, which is, "Contestation must be in play for politics to become democratic. Democracy does not speak in unison. Its tunes are dissonant and necessarily so." It's kind of like one of the discussions that came up after the Trump presidency began, where we're talking about how protest is the highest form of patriotism because you have to work in a framework that is democratic. We can't just go dropping bombs on people because we don't like them. Though you bring in human rights and everything else, feel like there was a different way to handle that. But again, not my call. So next time we're going to cover chapter 2 on gender regulations, which will probably be a very in-depth video. So I hope you'll join us, and I'll see you next time. Bye!